Welcome back to my channel Zoology at 180, and let's start the new series of the human physiology from NCERT 11th class. Also follow the Telegram channel link for the daily practice paper given in the description of this video. So students, let's start with the human physiology, the first topic, the breathing and exchange of gases from NCERT, starting from page number 183 onwards. So you know that we all breathe, isn't it? So we take oxygen inside and we release the carbon dioxide outside. And why we require this oxygen? This oxygen is required for the breakdown of the food substances like the glucose, the amino acids, the fats. And when we break down, what we get is called as the energy in the form of the energy currency called as ATP. And you know that this energy is required, this ATP is required for daily activities. For example, now I'm writing, I use the ATP. You are watching, you are using the ATP. So we can't do any work without the use of the energy, that is the ATP. So how to get this ATP? We had to break down the food. And when we break down the food in the presence of oxygen, this is called as the aerobic type of respiration, which help in supplying of the energy or the ATP. Let's go back to a very simple equation. As you know, I'm not giving a balanced equation. So this is glucose. In the presence of oxygen, the breakdown occurs. And what we get is, we get lot of ATP, say 36 ATP, we get carbon dioxide, and of course we get water. So this means that to get continuous supply of energy ATP, we have to continuously break down the food substances. So you have seen that in this metabolic activity, we are using the oxygen and we are releasing the CO2. So we have to continuously take the oxygen from the atmosphere, and we cannot store the CO2 as it is toxic, so we have to release it out. So this process of exchange of oxygen from the atmosphere with this carbon dioxide, which is produced by the cell, is called as the breathing, which you also generally call as respiration. In this unit, we will be discussing about the process of breathing and how we exchange the gases, the two main gases, the oxygen, which is used to burn the food to get the ATP, and how we release the carbon dioxide. So let's start with the next topic, the respiratory organs. So you have seen that every organism has to take the oxygen and release the carbon dioxide. And for this, we require specialized structures called as respiratory organs. The type of respiratory organs depends upon the mechanism of respiration. As you know, some animals are aquatic, some animals are terrestrial, some are burrowing forms. So the mechanism of respiration varies, depends upon two main characteristics. And these are the habitat of the animal, that is where it is present, maybe in the parasitic form, free living, in the water, or on the terrestrial or in burrows. The second one is the complexity of the body, called as the level of organization. So whether a single cell or many cells or a group of cells called as tissue, organ system, they are responsible for the respiration process. Now let's see phylum wise for all the animals in the animal kingdom. So start with the lowest phylum, the basic phylum, the sponges, the coelenterates, and the platyhelminthes or the flatworms. In these animals, the entire body surface will help in the exchange of gases. Always remember, the exchange of gases is simple diffusion method. Coming to the next phylum, the Annelida, the most common organisms like earthworm, they have a moist cuticle. The whole body wall is kept moist, and this will help in the exchange of the gases. In the case of arthropods like insects, they have a tubular system called as the tracheal system. The tracheal system is a network of tubes, and this will help in the transport of the oxygen directly to the cells and tissues within the body. So in the insects, we have the specialized tubules called as the tracheal system. Moving on to the higher aquatic forms, it can be the aquatic arthropods like the crabs and the prawns, or it can be the mollusca. As the body has become more complicated, they have structures called as gills which help in the respiration. These gills are highly vascularized. That is, they contain lot of blood circulation, which will help in the exchange of the gases. Respiration by gills is called as the branchial respiration. In the higher terrestrial forms, that is the terrestrial arthropods like the spiders, like the scorpions, and also the terrestrial molluscan forms, the vascularized bags are present, and these bags are now called as the lungs. In the arthropods, we can see the book lungs are present, and in the mollusca, the mantle cavity will act as a lung. Respiration by the lung-like structure is called as the pulmonary respiration, and these structures act as the pulmonary sacs. Moving on to the chordates, that is the higher forms like the vertebrates starting from the fishes. The fishes have gills for respiration, thus called as the branchial respiration. There are exceptions. We also have a few lungfishes which have a single or two lungs. Remaining all the fishes have the branchial respiration. The class Amphibia is slightly different. The aquatic forms have gills, the adult forms have lungs. In the frog, the buccal will also help in the respiration, and one of the most common respiratory structure is the skin. So respiration by gills is called as branchial, lungs is called as pulmonary, buccal is called as buccal respiration, and I think you remember, skin is called as cutaneous respiration. In the remaining three classes, that is reptilia, aves, and mammalia, the only structure for respiration are the lungs. So these are different type of respiratory structures. Let's quickly revise them. The respiratory organs in every organism depends upon two main things, that is the habitat where it lives and the level of organization, that is the body complexity. If you go phylum wise, in sponges, coelentrates and flatworms, the body is much simple and most of them live in the water or a parasitic forms. So here the entire body surface will help in the exchange of gases. In the case of earthworms, the moist cuticle is present. Insects have a specialized tubular structures called as the tracheal system. Aquatic forms of arthropods and the mollusca will have gills for respiration, whereas the terrestrial form of arthropods and mollusca will have vascularized bags called as the lungs. Higher forms like the vertebrates, in the case of fishes, it is gills, a few exceptions are there, and amphibia have gills, lungs, buccal as well as cutaneous respiration through skin. Higher forms like reptiles, aves and mammals, we respire only through the lungs. Let's dive deep into the respiratory structures in the humans. So let's start with the human respiratory system, and the system starts with one pair of external nostrils. These are present above the upper lip region. So as you can see in the diagram, these are the pair of external nostrils. These external nostrils open into a small nasal passage, and this nasal passage later opens into the nasal chamber present above the palate. So above our buccal region or the buccal chamber, this is the nasal chamber present above the palate. So the nostrils open into a small nasal passage and then into the nasal chamber. From there, we have a common passage called as the pharynx. So pharynx is a common area for both food as well as the air. So the air which enters from the nasal region and the food which is coming from the oral region, these two will cross at the pharynx region. So as you see, this is a common passage for both food and the air. Now this food passes through the food pipe called as the esophagus, present on the dorsal side, and the air passes into the windpipe called as the trachea, and trachea is present on the ventral side. Before entering into the trachea, there is a small larynx, the voice box is present. The voice box is present on the upper region of the trachea, and this voice box is called as the larynx. On this voice box, that is the larynx region, a small thin flap-like cartilage is present, and this will prevent the entry of food into the larynx. And this small flap-like structure is called as the epiglottis. So as we have seen, from the larynx, the trachea will continue. This trachea will pass into the mid of the thoracic region. So the trachea at the mid of thoracic region, at the junction of fifth thoracic vertebrae, that is the T5, it divides into two branches called as the primary bronchi. This primary bronchi will again branch into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and so on. And from there we get the networks called as the bronchioles, which are much finer tubular structures. These bronchioles will later end into the alveoli. So from the bronchi, the branches bronchioles and the alveoli, this will form the lungs. So let's see how the branching starts. So these are the primary bronchi, which divides into secondary and tertiary, which will later divide into much finer bronchioles, and these bronchioles will later form into the alveoli. So this will comprise the lungs. So coming back to the trachea, as I told, at the fifth thoracic vertebrae, that is the T5, they divide into two branches called as the primary bronchi. These primary bronchi will go for repeated branching, and this repeated branching will form secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and so on. From there, we get finer branches called as the bronchioles. These bronchioles will go for further branching, and they will end up in the terminal bronchioles. These terminal bronchioles then end up into a number of very thin-walled, vascularized bags called as alveoli. And if you remember, alveoli is the structural and functional unit of the lungs. Now, as the air passes, it's required that we should prevent the collapse of the trachea and the branches of trachea. To prevent the collapse of the trachea, there are incomplete C-shaped cartilaginous rings present in the trachea, bronchi, and initial bronchioles. So as you can see in the diagram, the trachea, the bronchi, and the branches of the bronchi up to the initial bronchioles, they have the C-shaped rings, and these rings will prevent the collapse of the trachea. So coming to the functions of the respiratory system in humans, function-wise, we can divide the system into two parts called as the conducting part and the respiratory part. The conducting part consists from the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles. So part starting from the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles is called as the conducting part. So this part will help in conducting the air, as you can see in the diagram, from the atmosphere, from there to the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the regions of the bronchioles. They only help in passing the air up to the bronchioles region. So this part is called as the conducting part. The main functions of the conducting part is, as you can say, it conducts, it transports the air up to the lower lung region. It helps in clearing the air. If you can see that in our nostrils fine hair are present, which help in cleaning it. It humidifies the air. The mucus present in your nasal region will help in humidifying the air and bringing the air to the body temperature. So these are the major functions of the conducting part. So conducting part, as the name says, will conduct, and it starts from the external nostrils up to the terminal bronchioles region. The second part is called as the respiratory part. The respiratory part is the region which consists of the alveoli and the fine alveolar ducts. So this region is called as respiratory part, where actually the exchange of the gases will occur. So this is the region where the O2 and CO2 are exchanged. So also called as the exchange region or the exchange part. The exchange of the gases is, as you know, is by simple diffusion method. So this is the human respiratory system. Let's quickly revise. The system starts with a pair of external nostrils, passage into the nasal passage, from there follow to the nasal chamber. The common passage for food and the air is called as the pharynx. From there it passes through the voice box called as larynx. The larynx is covered by a small flap called as epiglottis, which will prevent the entry of the food into the trachea region. The tubular windpipe is called as trachea, which at the fifth thoracic vertebrae divides into two primary bronchi. From there, the branching starts as secondary and tertiary bronchi, and the finer branches called as the bronchioles. The trachea, bronchi, and some bronchioles are covered by a C-shaped ring-like structures, and this cartilaginous rings will prevent the collapse of the trachea. Starting from the bronchi, the branches of bronchi, bronchioles, up to the alveoli will form the lung region. Function-wise, we can divide the system into two parts. The conducting part, starting from the nostrils to the terminal bronchioles, which help in transportation of the air. It helps in clearing or filtering the air, humidifies the air so that it can come to the body temperature. This is also called as conditioning. The second part is called as the respiratory part or the exchange part. This consists of the fine ducts along with the alveoli. So this is about the human respiratory system. Let's continue with the structure of lungs. So let's see the structure of lungs. So we have a pair of pinkish color lungs, and these lungs are covered by a double layer structure called as the pleura. So as it is double layer, we can call it as the outer pleural membrane and the inner pleural membrane. And the gap between the two is filled with a fluid called as the pleural fluid. The outer pleural membrane is in the close contact with the thorax. So the outer pleural membrane, as you can see in the diagram, is in close contact with the thorax. And the inner pleural membrane is in close contact with the lung surface. So in the diagram you can see, this is the inner pleural, which is same as the lung region. And the gap between the two is filled with the pleural fluid. A special character of the human lungs is the human lungs are present in thoracic chamber, and we can say this is anatomically airtight chamber. Now what does it mean? It means that the lungs are present in the thoracic region and there is no space between the lung and the thorax. That is, it acts as an airtight chamber. Now, this thoracic chamber has dorsally vertebral column. It has ventrally sternum. It has ribs on the lateral sides. On both the sides, it has the ribs on the lateral sides. And on the lower side, it has a diaphragm. So as you can see, this is the thoracic chamber, which consists of the vertebral column, the sternum, the diaphragm, and the ribs, which is completely covering the thoracic region. So in between these, the lungs are present, and thus this becomes the airtight chambers. Now, what do you mean by this? Now, this type of setup is such that any change in the volume of thoracic cavity will be reflected in the lung capacity or the pulmonary capacity. Thus, if you want to change the volume of the lung, we have to change the volume of the thoracic region, because the lungs and thorax are in the airtight chamber conditions. Now, why we have such type of anatomical setup? Because we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Now, what does the whole thing mean? Let me explain in very simple terms. See, we have a pair of lungs, and this is the place where the gases are exchanged, that is, exchange of O2 and CO2 will occur. Now, when air has to pass in and out, we have to change the volume or the capacity of the lungs. As you know, lungs does not have any muscles, they cannot expand themselves, they cannot contract themselves. So what to do? So we had to take the help of thoracic chamber. A thoracic chamber is airtight chamber which is completely covered by the vertebral column dorsally, the sternum ventrally, ribs laterally, and diaphragm on the lower side. So this airtight chamber, what we see here in the diagram, will help to alter the capacity or the volume. So as the volume of the thorax changes, the lungs automatically changes. Now this will help in the proper type of the respiration, inhalation and exhalation process. Right? So remember that lungs, one pair of pinkish structures, and these are covered by a double pleural membrane. The outer pleura is in close contact with thorax, and the inner pleura is in close contact with the surface of the lung itself. Of course, to prevent the friction, we have the pleural fluid. Thoracic chamber acts as the airtight chamber so that any change in the thoracic cavity will reflect in the lung. This will help in easily changing the volume and the capacity of the lungs. So this is about the structure of lungs. So let's continue with the steps of respiration. So let's see the steps in respiration. You know, the oxygen from the atmospheric air should enter up to the cells in the body. So this air has to enter into our corresponding lungs, that is the respiratory organs in the humans, from where it is taken by the blood to different organs in the body. So let's see how the steps go on. So we inhale oxygen from the atmospheric air. This oxygen reaches the lungs, called as inhalation process. Meanwhile, by exhalation process, we release the CO2, the carbon dioxide. So this is the first step in the respiration, called as breathing, where we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out carbon dioxide. This is also called as the pulmonary ventilation, where the air moves in and out. So the first step is called as breathing or pulmonary ventilation, which occurs between the air and the lungs. So now the oxygen reaches the lungs, and if I take a small part of it, these are the alveoli, which are surrounded by the blood capillary. And if you remember, this is the exchange path where the O2 and CO2 get exchanged. So in the lungs, we have the exchange part between the alveoli and the blood. So this is the step 2, and the second step is called as the exchange at the lungs, called as the pulmonary exchange. So pulmonary exchange is the simple diffusion method between the alveoli and the blood. So as the O2 and CO2 are mixed in the blood, now they start moving. The O2 moves from the lungs to the body parts, and the CO2 collected from the tissues goes back into the lungs. Now this is the third part called as the transport of gases. And the two gases are oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and the CO2 from the tissues to the lungs. So the third step is called as the transport of gases. So as the gases reaches the tissue level, here we have one more exchange. So oxygen enters into the tissue and from there enters into the cells. So when the oxygen enters into the cell, we have another exchange, and this is called as systemic exchange. Systemic exchange is the fourth step which occurs between the tissue or the blood near the tissues up to the cells. Now this oxygen present in the cells is taken up by the mitochondria for the combustion process. So the O2 is taken inside the mitochondria, lot of ATP is released. Along with this, the carbon dioxide is also released. Now this carbon dioxide will move back into the blood, from there into the lungs, and from there back into the air. So the last step which occurs in the cell is called as the cellular respiration. Along with your topics in the botany, you will study about the cellular respiration, the main catabolic activity to release the ATP. So in this chapter, we'll discuss only about the first 4 steps. That is the breathing or the pulmonary ventilation. We'll discuss about the pulmonary exchange, about the transport of gases, and about the systemic exchange. So in the coming videos, you'll be seeing all this in detail. So let's quickly revise. The first step is breathing, exchange of gases between the atmospheric air and the lungs. The second step is the pulmonary exchange, where the air from the alveoli enters into the blood and vice versa. The third step is the transport of gases done by the blood, O2 towards the tissue and CO2 back to the lungs. The fourth step is the systemic exchange. This exchange occurs near the tissue. So let's see in detail about all these steps in the coming videos. Do subscribe the channel and also follow the Telegram link for the daily practice papers.